Good evening. How's everybody doing? Good? Well, I'm glad you're here. This is a formation night. This is our first formation night, and I'm so glad that you're here. We're trying to do something extra besides revival night, and formation nights are going to look a lot different than revival nights. They're basically nights where we come and we'll hear a testimony, or we'll hear a witness from someone, or we'll have a teaching. The next formation night is in June, and I'm going to do a teaching mass. It's not going to be an actual mass, but it's everything that you ever wanted to know about the mass, and why does this happen, and why do you do this, and what does this mean? And I'll also give you an opportunity to ask questions. So look out for that. It'll be on our website and bulletin and all those. So next formation night will be a teaching mass. So I'm going to ask you to stand, and we'll say a prayer to start our evening here. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, amen. Good and gracious God, you are strength to those who suffer and comfort to those who grieve. We lift up our prayers for all your children who are in trouble. We ask in a special way for those who are being captive, or those who have been kidnapped. We pray for their release. We pray for their captors, that their hearts may be softened. Surround those who have been shaken by tragedy with a sense of your present love. Hold them in faith. Though they are lost in grief, may they find you and be comforted. We thank you and we praise you, and we ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. Have a seat. So it's my honor to introduce to you Sam Goodwin. Sam is from St. Louis, Missouri. He is the oldest of 5 children. I know Sam's family through a buddy of mine here in Miami. I met his brother, and then through his brother, I got to know his family. And you'll hear a little bit about how I got involved in this whole process, and how this parish, which Sam is here tonight to give thanks to you, because this parish was very instrumental, I believe, in his release, because we prayed every day for Sam. If you remember, we had a picture here at St. Anthony, the patron saint for those who are lost or lost items. So we prayed for Sam in a very special way. So I'm going to let Sam do the talking here. I'm going to step back. But before I bring Sam up, I just want to show you a video.
Good evening. This is our Western edition, and we begin with breaking news from overseas. A St. Louis man held since the spring by the Assad regime in war-torn Syria has been released and has been reunited with his parents. His name is Sam Goodwin, and his freedom tonight comes as the result of top-secret international negotiations involving a member of the Lebanese military. Don Daler leads us off tonight with new information, including what brought Goodwin to Syria.
So with that, I bring up Sam Goodwin. Welcome, Sam.
Thank you. I'm going to explain that video. So a quick backstory, a little bit of background. My curiosity about the world and its people dates back as far as I can remember. In grade 3, I made it to the championship round of my class's geography bee. And my teacher, Miss Keller, I remember her reading the final question. It was, name the largest and only Portuguese-speaking country on the continent of South America. I thought about it briefly, and I visualized the globe next to my bed that my parents had given me. And then I said, Brazil. And this was the correct answer. And it earned me a 3-night homework pass. And I was really excited about that. But about 2 decades later, this curiosity had persisted, and it led to me relocating overseas to begin my professional career in Singapore, where I lived and worked for 6 years as head of investor relations for a tech startup business and a regional NGO. And during this time, any opportunity that I had away from work, despite having limited money at the time, I took advantage of the opportunity to travel and to explore as much of the region and beyond as possible. And this passion for unique experiences and deeper understanding, it evolved into a desire to try to experience every country in the world. Something that few people had done, required a lot of careful calculations and planning. But as I progressed, the off the beaten path destinations and the places that Western media tells you you're not supposed to like, those were the places where I had many of my best experiences, despite them not always being maybe as visitor friendly. Places like Central Africa and rural Asia, and especially the Middle East. There are 193 fully recognized United Nations sovereign states. And by May of 2019, exactly 2 years ago from right now, I had traveled to 180 of the 193 countries in the world. With 13 to go, I went to Syria, a country that is experiencing arguably the most tragic humanitarian crisis of our generation, a brutal civil war. But in the same way that other crisis-stricken nations had provided many of my best experiences, I was confident that the same was going to ring true here. One of the most compelling things for me about Syria was its religious significance. Modern-day Syria is the cradle of civilization. It's mentioned more than 300 times in the Bible. Paul the Apostle's conversion took place on the road to Damascus. King David conquered northern Syria. Mary Magdalene was of Syrian descent. I've been to Catholic churches in 115 countries and attended Mass in 65 of them. In fact, the reason that I chose to enter Syria on a Saturday was so that I could go to Mass there the following morning. Little did I know, God had other plans. And I didn't make it to Mass that Sunday, or any of the next 9 Sundays. I followed the exact path of other journalists and aid workers and travelers before me, and I entered the Kurdish-held northeast region of the country. Just 2 hours after arriving the small town of Qamishli, I was walking through a roundabout when all of a sudden a black pickup truck abruptly pulled up next to me. 2 armed men swung open the back doors, jumped out of the truck, and instructed me to get inside. Thankfully, the men were not violent, but I did not have a choice. As we drove away, I desperately tried to understand, what was happening. Despite the broken English, it quickly became clear that these men, these military officials, were loyal to Syrian President Bashar al-Assad, and they had immediately raised skepticism around my travel motives. As we sped down back alleys of the city, the men accused me of espionage and terrorist collaboration. Nothing like this had ever happened to me before. Having a problem while trying to travel to every country, or particularly while being in Syria, was kind of this classic example of just everything is fine until it isn't. As we continue driving, the soldier sitting next to me, he suddenly reached into his pocket and he pulled out a blindfold and he put it over my eyes. We drove for about 2 minutes. The van stopped. I stepped out. They took the blindfold off. I looked up and I was underneath a massive Syrian military airplane out on the tarmac of an airport. They handcuffed me, took me over to the ladder, escorted me up the ladder, and put me in the cargo hold of the plane. No opportunity to explain myself. We were airborne within minutes. I have a question for you here. How many of you have ever been flying on an airplane and not known where the plane is going? This was the situation that I found myself in, and when this all started to hit, this just intense storm of uncertainty came over me. 90 minutes later, the plane landed in what I learned to be Damascus, the Syrian capital city. I was taken from the airport, driven to the center of town, and taken into the basement of a facility known as Syria's Military Intelligence Prison number 215, a facility notoriously known for housing political prisoners. The officer in charge, he escorted me to a cell in the back of the basement. After putting me in there, he went to the inside of the cell door, and he spoke a little bit of English, and he said, "Food, water, toilet, knock. Otherwise, quiet, no talking." And he slammed the door and left. I was stunned and in disbelief about what had happened in just a few short hours. My life had spiraled out of control in the most terrifying of ways. I felt exactly the way the Syrians wanted me to. Hopeless and utterly cut off from any control of my life. The disorientation of not being able to just open the door myself, it set in real quickly. One of my first instincts was to try to reach for the reset button or the rewind button, but that didn't exist. This wasn't a game. It was all real. There was no way to do that. There's a relatively well-known American journalist named Hunter Thompson, and he wrote a quote that said, "The edge, there's no honest way to explain it because the only people who really know where it is are the ones who have gone over." And in that moment, I felt like I had gone over the edge. Thankfully, the cell wasn't too small. I could walk around a little bit. It had a light bulb, but there was no window. It was all concrete, and I had nothing but a blanket to lay on the concrete floor as a bed. In addition to Arabic graffiti all around the walls, I quickly noticed something else. Everywhere there were these charts or tables, and in the boxes were X's. It doesn't matter if you read left to right or right to left or up and down. It was clear what these charts were. They were calendars. I remained here in this cell in solitary confinement for 27 days. My only human interaction was for a few seconds in the morning and evening when the guards brought bread and boiled potatoes and water. I had to request to go to the bathroom, and I was sometimes allowed to do so. The bathroom was just this hole in the floor, a few steps outside the cell door. But from that hole, I could look up and see a small window to the outside. So I started trying to time my bathroom requests with when I thought there was a change from day to night. This was something that helped me remain psychologically in tune. I never saw another inmate during this entire time, but the facility was not soundproof. And every day from the neighboring cells, I would hear the sounds of brutal beatings and whippings and torture. I realized that I was in an environment where truly nothing was off limits. And I couldn't help but wonder, when was my turn? I chipped a rock off the cell wall, and I drew my own calendar. I was keeping track of the days by when the food was brought and when I went to the bathroom. I felt this incredible guilt over the combination of worry and helplessness that I knew my family must have been experiencing. I knew that people would realize that I was missing and try to do something, but every time I had that thought, I would then look around at these 4 dungeon walls, and I just felt hopelessly out of reach. As the days turned into weeks, the uncertainty became a living organism. I couldn't help but think that I had become a bargaining chip being held by these reckless geopolitical poker players who were all overrepresenting the cards they had in their hands. A normal or average prisoner spends their time counting down the days to the end of their sentence. But hostages count up. During this time, I found strength in several ways. I leaned on perspectives that I had developed from traveling to many corners of the world, which provoked gratitude for things like the food and water I was being given. I leaned on skills and traits that I developed from being a competitive athlete, the mental toughness, the critical thinking, the resiliency. I leaned on a desire to see my family and friends again, and a belief that I had a purpose in life. But above all, nothing was more important than my faith. Prayer was my lifeline, and it became this uninterrupted conversation with God. I was constantly talking to him, sometimes walking, pacing back and forth, just like I'm doing right now. And I would say things out loud, even though they told me not to talk. Okay, God, I'm here, I'm listening. What are you trying to tell me today? What can I learn today? What are the positives about my situation today? Throughout my entire captivity, my number one prayer was always, God, please keep my situation safe and peaceful. Please keep me physically unharmed. My second prayer was then about the timeline. You know, if this was all going to end peacefully, then the next question was when? And this was the prayer that became the most tricky and intense. And I often remember almost positioning it as like a business deal. I said, God, I know you have a plan, but is it possible? Would you consider an adjustment to the plan? Can that work with your schedule? I then finished all of my prayers with the rosary, and I have to admit, due to the stress of the situation, I sometimes couldn't remember like the exact mysteries all the times, and my rosaries sometimes just became 50 Hail Marys. But I would always dedicate my prayers to something different. I prayed for my family and my close friends. I prayed for Pope Francis. I prayed for anyone who I thought might be working towards my release. I prayed for my captors and the strength to forgive them, and for world peace. The days and the weeks passed. These prayers led to a closeness to God like I've never felt before. Faith and prayer were what forced the uncertainty to lose its grip. And my relationship with God became very simple. Everything had been taken from me. My material possessions, my communication, my freedom. But no matter what, I knew that my faith was absolute. Solitary confinement reminded me in a very dramatic way that we're never less alone than when we're totally alone with God. It was during this time, and I didn't know it, but my family back in the U.S. had begun this frantic search and rescue operation as a result of my disappearance. And for both, I think, practical and spiritual reasons, one of the first people that my father contacted was Father Vigoa. And among countless other things, he, maybe most importantly, asked the St. Augustine community to pray for me. In fact, I later learned, as he mentioned a few minutes ago, that there was even a picture of me on the St. Anthony statue right here in the church, with a note that said, "St. Anthony, please find Sam, bring him home safe, pray for him." On day 27, I was released from solitary confinement in order to be put on trial, a process that it lasted 4 weeks and was nothing short of a total sham. In all 5 of these courtroom sessions, I was dressed like a zebra, I was handcuffed, linked to a chain, and often forced to endure these crowds of Syrians gathered behind me who were just intrigued by this novelty of an American on trial. The judge denied me a lawyer and a translator and continued to characterize me as an American spy and a terrorist without providing any proof of any of that or any meaningful information about my fate. This trial was taking place inside this ideological vacuum and was not going to be impacted by anything I said or did. I was dealing with some of the most thoughtless and least sophisticated people I had ever encountered, and they held the keys, literally and figuratively, to the rest of my life. Meanwhile, during this time, I was reassigned to a facility called ADRA, which is Syria's central federal prison, and it houses more than 10,000 inmates. I was put in cell 108 in wing number 1, and I joined 35 others. With the exception of these 2 men from Central Asia, everybody there was Syrian. ADRA was like this small city, and my fellow inmates became friends. We cooked and we shared food together. They taught me some Arabic, I taught them some English. There was a prison basketball court, and I taught a few of them how to play knockout. There was one man who even smuggled a note out of the prison on my behalf, and this note successfully navigated this game of geopolitical telephone and made it to my father. And it served as the first time that I managed to communicate that I was alive. These men were a remarkable display of humanity, and my situation would have been much different if they wouldn't have treated me the way they did. Despite their kindness, I had reached the 2-month mark of being held captive as a political prisoner in the Middle East, and this just imposing cloud of uncertainty continued to loom overhead. On July 26th, 63 days since I had last had any contact with the outside world, a prison official came to my cell, he called my name, and he indicated that I was being moved. So I grabbed my stuff and he escorted me to the front of the prison. And while he was doing this, He stopped me and he said, "Sam, you're very lucky. President Assad has agreed to release you." This sounds encouraging, but I had been lied to so many times in the past 2 months that I'd become immune to believing anything like this. Outside, I stepped into a black SUV in the back seat, and it turned out that this was part of a 5-vehicle convoy that raced out of Damascus at what seemed to be 100 miles an hour. There was a siren blaring from one of them. We didn't stop at traffic lights. We used the shoulder of the road to maneuver around traffic. We drove towards the mountains and nobody said a word. The nice cars and the professional nature of the operation made me think that this was either really good or really bad. I was about to experience one extreme of the captivity spectrum here, but I didn't know which one it was. We came up to this checkpoint, which seemed to be some kind of significant border, and as we passed through, the official sitting next to me, he tapped me on the leg and he said, "Sam, you're in Lebanon. You're safe now." About an hour later, we arrived in Beirut at the headquarters of Lebanese Internal Security. And in addition to dozens of media reporters and intelligence officials, my parents were there, just culminating this moment that was indescribably emotional, one that many people thought might never happen, and a breathtaking display of God answering prayers. I had the chance to meet and thank General Abbas Ibrahim, one of the Middle East's most influential and respected political figures, who had directly mediated my release with the Syrians. That evening, my parents and I drove to a town called Byblos to visit Saint Charbel Monastery. And Saint Charbel was a 19th century Lebanese monk, and it turns out that his feast day was one day earlier, on the exact day that my release was granted. We made our way back to the U.S. the next day, and I learned that General Ibrahim's negotiations had led to President Assad finally dropping his bogus charges against me. I became and remain the only American to ever be freed by the Syrian government. Since returning home, I've been fortunate to be surrounded by an overwhelmingly purposeful support system, one that's included everything from terrific family and friends to visiting the Oval Office. I've been learning to survive survival, which has included a range of things from occasional episodes of PTSD to some somewhat interesting conversations with my bank, convincing them that being held hostage in a foreign country is grounds for credit card late fees to be forgiven. When I got back from Syria, I took some time to really sit and process things, but despite all that had happened, this curiosity about the world had really never been stronger. And when I first got home, my family pretty much shackled me to the kitchen table. My brothers wanted to throw away my passport, but that eased, and I set out to visit the last 12 countries of my journey. And one of those 12 countries was an island that's not too far from here. And I have to tell you, I cannot imagine that there is a better way to go to Cuba than with Father Vigoa. Let me see here. Here we are. We visited St. Augustine Church, the sister church of this one in Havana, and we also had the chance to meet Juan Garcia Rodriguez, who just a few days earlier had been named a cardinal by Pope Francis. In December of that year, I completed my journey to every country in the world. And I finished in a country that is home to more Catholics than any other country in the world. And one that I think would maybe make my third grade teacher, Miss Keller, a little bit proud. It was Brazil. When I was released from Syria, one of the most overwhelming things for me was learning about how God worked on the outside while I was trapped on the inside, and the number of people who worked and prayed tirelessly on my behalf. My family and friends and everyone they mobilized did so much to get me out, some of which I'm sure they'll never share. Today, nearly 2 years later, I'm still working to say thank you to all of these people. And one of the biggest reasons that I'm here this evening is to say thank you to the St. Augustine Parish. I received so many prayers from the community here, and when I look back on my captivity and everything that happened, I truly feel like I needed every one of them. And maybe even to have my picture on the statue. But thank you so much, and I'm forever indebted to the parish here. It's interesting. Some people hear this story, a lot of people hear this story, and they say, this guy is an idiot and never should have been in Syria in the first place. And lots of other people say, this guy is a hero for surviving. The truth is, I'm neither of those extremes. I fell into extraordinary circumstances and just did my best as a human being to embrace and manage them. You know, we can't always choose the exact path that we take in life, but we can always choose the way in which we walk it. I sometimes end my presentation here, but when I do, and I start the Q&A, the first question is usually, so how exactly did you get out? Much of what I've told you this evening has been the story of one man in a cell. But in truth, there was something much bigger happening. It was God's story. I was Assad's hostage, but only until God accomplished what he intended to through my captivity. Let me give you the SparkNotes version of what happened. So, news of my disappearance was learned simply through me going dark. I'm usually very good about checking in, and I had communicated to my family that I would be leaving Syria on Monday morning. When Tuesday rolled around and they hadn't heard from me, they began to wonder what was going on. My father works in civil engineering, my mother is a registered nurse turned educator, and although both of them are smart people and have had relative success in their respective fields, neither one of them had any idea what to do when their son went missing in the Middle East. But thankfully, they began to act and quickly reached the local FBI field office. Over the next week, this rapidly escalated to the highest levels of the US government, including the CIA and the State Department, and President Trump was briefed multiple times on my case in the Situation Room of the White House. My family worked through the Catholic Church and even managed to reach Pope Francis, who communicated with Cardinal Mario Zannari based in Damascus. But these Middle East NGOs, the US military, the private sector security companies, Russian intelligence, they all mobilized all of these resources to find information about a missing American, but all of them came up empty. In these first few weeks, the US government strongly recommended that my family keep a lid on this situation and keep it out of the news. They communicated that if my captors, depending on who they were, caught wind of any publicity, that they may feel threatened and as a result just kill me. They also communicated to my family, you should really manage your expectations because Sam is probably going to be missing for a long time. On June 15th, which was 3 weeks into my captivity, my younger sister, Stephanie, who lives in Nashville, had just had enough. She just couldn't hold it in any longer. She had to talk to somebody just to blow off some steam. So she decided she was going to call her former college roommate, who is coincidentally also named Stephanie. And as the story goes, the conversation went something like this. Roommate Steph says, "Hey, how's it going?" And my sister says, "Honestly, it's not very good. My brother has been missing in Syria for 3 weeks and nobody's heard from him." Of course, roommate Steph is shocked to hear this and just offers her support and her prayers. And at the end of the call, roommate Steph says, "If there's anything I can do, just let me know. I'm always here for you." And my sister, basically joking, says, "Honestly, unless you know Assad, please just pray." And roommate Steph says, "Wait, let me call you back." It turns out that roommate Steph is Lebanese, and her uncle is close friends with General Abbas Ibrahim in Lebanon, and they too were roommates in the Lebanese military academy. General Ibrahim has a secret relationship with the Syrians, and after a few weeks was able to mediate my release. My sister had no idea that the other Steph was Lebanese. She couldn't locate Lebanon on a map. She had no idea that it was close to Syria. She was just calling a friend for support in a time where she desperately needed it. And I believe that if she would have decided to just call a different friend, I might not be standing up here today. So the FBI, the CIA, President Trump, the US military were all powerless to act. But my sister's college roommate could get the first American hostage ever released out of Syria. How does that work? There's still a lot of disorientation for me today around the questions of why and what was God's purpose with all this. And maybe he was using prison to bring me closer to him, and if that's the case, I wish he would have chosen a different method. But when I look back on my entire life, I see that God has been there for me through the tough spots every single time. But what I think I was most profoundly reminded of through this experience is that nothing is too complicated for God. I'm embarrassed to say that I created about as big of a mess as I think maybe anybody in this church could imagine, certainly bigger than I could have ever imagined. I was being held hostage in the middle of a brutal civil war where war crimes and mass atrocities have been rampant for 10 years. The most powerful and influential people in the world were working on this, and the result that everyone was working towards had never happened in history. Doesn't sound very encouraging, does it? But when God was ready to fix this, he made it happen very simply and quickly with a phone call between two 25-year-old girls who used to be college roommates. How does that happen? Well, as I mentioned earlier, because it's God's story. Thank you. Yeah. Thanks.
I think Michelle has the microphone. We're going to take some questions. But, you know, St. Augustine's, as Sam was saying, was very involved in praying for Sam. And just so that you know, when Sam's dad calls me, I was at my desk and he says, Father Vigoa, Sam's gone missing. Now, I knew that Sam was going around. We had talked about maybe going, because I had connected him with some of my priest friends that work in nuncios in Africa. So I was very involved in his traveling. Where are you going next? What's going on? And let me connect you with some of the people that I know around the world that maybe that can help you. I think your experience in Burkina Faso was amazing. Yeah. He lands in Burkina Faso, and on the plane, this guy comes on the plane and says, Sam Goodwin. Comes down the stairs, and there's a Vatican car waiting for him to take him to the news.
True story. Yeah.
But so I was involved in his travels, and so when his dad calls me, I said, what? And he said, we're going to need your help. I said, what am I going to do, you know? And so through my contacts, we were able to contact the Vatican, and through a contact that I had in Washington, D.C., through Catholic Charities and CRS. And so we were able to get Cardinal Zanari's cell phone number, which Cardinal Zanari is the nuncio in Damascus.
Where was he at the time?
Well, he was in Rome at the time. And when I finally get him on the phone, he was, well, first he yelled at me. And then he says, do you understand the position that you're putting me in? And he says, this is a stupid, stupid boy. And he says, this will not end well for him. He will die in Syria. And I said, oh my gosh. I said to him, I understand your eminence, and we're sorry, but we still love him and we want him to come home, you know. But and Sam was talking about here at the end about the backstory, like, because there was a team of us, and we were, I was part of that team. I was blessed to be on that team, and it was.
Just quickly interrupt. My father says that Father Vigoa was there for me 24/7 through this.
Yeah, it was. Some days we would be talking 3, 4, 5, 6 times a day. And we weren't supposed to be on the. And his dad would put the FBI on speaker, and we were all listening. But it was juggling a lot of balls in the air at the same time. And but the one point that I just want to make is that one of the more difficult days is we flew to New York to be at the United Nations because we were trying to secure an appointment with the Syrians. And the Syrian ambassador would not even meet with us. They would not even acknowledge that we were there. And so through the Vatican representative, we were trying to have a meeting. And that's when we met some very important people there. And I remember the nuncio telling Anne, his mom, and basically what you said, manage expectations, because Sam's going to be in Syria for a very long time. And so, and the reality is we need to pray for hostages. There is one American, right? Austin Tice is still in Syria. He's being held in Syria, and his family has tried to negotiate his release, and they have not been able to. So, but we'll open it up for some questions. Anybody have a question? What's that?
Yeah, it's a great question. So we actually did that. We went back to Abbas Ibrahim in Lebanon about Austin Tice, and it's a complicated case. But the Syrians' response to Abbas Ibrahim about Austin is that we don't have him.
But I think just to answer that too is I think that Austin Tice has been in like 7, 8 years, yeah. Right? And so by that time, Syria had been publicly saying to the United States, we don't have him. He's not here. He's not a hostage here. So to kind of reverse course, I think would have been kind of crazy.
Exactly.
So did you take like 1 year to go around the world?
Yeah, it's a good question. So when I started traveling, which was early when I went to Singapore, it was never to try to travel to every country in the world. I traveled because I enjoyed it and it was fun, but most importantly, I learned from it. Just a personal preference, I didn't like to repeat places. So even if I went somewhere and had a fantastic time, the next opportunity, like off work, the next weekend, I would always go somewhere different. When I put this formula into play for 6 years in Singapore, I realized in early 2018 that I had traveled to 120 countries. And so at this point, I started thinking like, how many are there, right? How many are there? And I started looking at, some different things, and I thought, maybe I could do this. This is a little bit crazy, but maybe I could. And so that's when I kind of got into some, questionable life decisions and career decisions and things like that. But I said, for this last bit here, I think if I prioritize it full time, I think I can maybe do this. And so it was a little bit uncrazy. It was uncomfortable to kind of leave the safety nets of a place to live and things like that. But the last leg of this, for the last year, I was doing it full time. But before that, that was never the objective with traveling. It just kind of worked its way into the picture at the end. No, I can hear you, yeah.
Okay, so they're from St. Louis, Missouri, and I met his dad through a friend of mine here in Miami. His dad contacted a friend who they do business together, and he said to him, listen, I'm looking for my son to do some sort of experience because he studied Spanish at University of Pennsylvania.
Yeah, this is a different son. This is my brother.
His brother David. And so his dad says to my friend, do you know of where my son could go, maybe in Central or South America, to do an experience? And so my buddy said to me, hey, I have a friend of mine who's in St. Louis, who's looking for his son to do an experience. I said, well, really, I can send him to Cuba to go to one of these dioceses, and we send him to Holguín. We sent him to Santa Clara. And he did a great job. He was there. He worked in the rectory. He taught a class. He taught English to the kids, and he had a really great experience. He spent the summer there. And then David and I became friends. We were in Cuba for the installation of Juan Garcia, and David came to that mass. And so we became very friendly. He would come to Miami, and then through David, I got to know Sam, and that's how I got to know the family.
Yeah, so I've traveled every country in the world, and it's interesting because some of the places that are negatively perceived or have instability, I had truly some of my best experiences, and that's really a topic for an entire other presentation. But I think that there is just so, in these places, there's no doubt that there is instability and there's conflict, but there's also a lot of other things happening too. And I feel very fortunate and grateful to say that I was able to experience many of those other things.
He played hockey with the North Korean Olympic team, right?
I coached him, yeah.
Yeah.
I coached him.
Have you been to the 50 states?
I actually have been to all 50 states, yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. No, it's okay. I appreciate it. I was just going to say, it's kind of interesting. I'll do some different presentations in different places, and sometimes when I'm talking to like businesses or in a corporate setting, as I'm preparing for that, I'll say, is there anything that you don't want me to talk about? And I get kind of the same answer every time. It's religion and politics. And I think to myself, well, okay, there's lots of other things that I can talk about, but they're getting a relatively incomplete story if I leave that out. And to piggyback off of your comment, I would have been in a completely different situation without my faith. I think the outside search and rescue operation would have been in a completely different situation without that as well. And so it's just the story is entirely incomplete without that.
Well, that's what his captors thought he was.
Ask the Syrians. They checked it out pretty quick.
Yeah. I think you have a question.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, first of all, for sharing.
Thank you. Thank you.
Most people, I think, won't necessarily be in a similar position where you're taken out of the world, an environment where you would accomplish success, you know how to negotiate, navigate that world, and put something entirely different. Were there any skills that you brought from your life experience or whatnot that helped you there, or did you learn any new skills when you were going through that that you now kept?
One thing that comes to mind when I hear that question is I just remember leaning on every possible experience and lesson and teaching that I had ever encountered in my life to get through all of these different situations. There was a 6-hour-long interrogation that I didn't mention tonight where I was handcuffed and blindfolded and threatened. The interrogator threatened to hand me over to ISIS. And I just remember thinking, wow, I'm really glad that I was a competitive athlete because I'm leaning on those skills. I'm glad that, I've traveled to different places and have a perspective. I'm glad that I have a family at home that I know loves me and is working on this. And so I just remember thinking to myself, I'm really using and needing all of these things right now to help get me through this situation. Yeah. Yeah, it's a great question, and there's still a little bit of uncertainty around the answer to that question. One of the things that happened was that because of the Civil War, I won't go too much into the geopolitical situation, but the country is fractured. There's lots of different players who are controlling different areas of the country, and I went to an area that's controlled by the Kurds, and the Kurds have, relatively speaking, a good relationship with the United States. And so this is really the safest place of the country for an American, and that's all relative. But throughout my entire journey, safety was always the top priority, as much as it can be on a journey like this. But I had permission from the Kurds to be there. I had Kurdish travel credentials and permission, and inadvertently crossed paths with the Syrian with Assad's officials, and they essentially looked at my credentials and said, "We don't recognize these. You're here illegally." And from there, it escalated to them accusing me of espionage and being a spy, accusing me of working with terrorists in the region. So that's likely, what I believe happened was kind of the wires got crossed there. There's also some information that suggests that I was set up a little bit, but that's that's a lot fuzzier, and we're not sure. Oh my gosh. I went to DeSmet. How about you? Okay, great.
I'm gonna ask a question. I haven't asked you this question before, but Sam touched on it. He was able to smuggle a note out, and that was like the first time that we knew that we didn't know if the note was for real, but there was a proof of life on the note. So
I have a picture of it.
You have a picture of it?
Yeah.
But my question to you, and kind of say what the note said. The note said,
I can tell you what happened with this note.
Well, what was on the note? What did the note say?
It said, I'm safe, I'm alive, I need consular help. Contact the U.S. Embassy in Beirut, because that's what the other prisoners were telling me. And then I put a clue at the bottom of the note, and I wrote, I'm excited for my next salmon dinner at the Missouri Athletic Club. And the Missouri Athletic Club is just a place that my family are members to in St. Louis. And this was a way to authenticate that it came from me. And so I was thinking, if this happens to make it to where this could potentially go, I want them to know for sure. And I'm probably off topic from your question right now, but my family talks about how they did in fact receive the note, and they went to the U.S. government intelligence officials and told them, we are 100% certain that this came from Sam because of that clue.
But my question is, why didn't you write a whole bunch? We were like, that's it? That's all you're giving us? Like, what happened? Where are you? I mean, it was like such a short note, and I've always wanted to ask you that. Why didn't you write more on that note if you're able to smuggle a note out?
Okay, so I'll tell you what happened. I'll give you the short version. This is like 3 weeks after I had been moved to the federal prison. So I had spent a month in solitary confinement. There was nothing happening there. It was completely cut off from the world. In the federal prison, still not a very comfortable place, but I had some interaction with these other inmates, and we could go outside, like I mentioned, we could play basketball, we could go into other cells and kind of, mingle, I guess. The other inmates realized somewhat quickly that I was just starving for communication. That's really what I wanted. And after being there for about 3 weeks, one of them came up to me, his name was Irfan, and he said to me, hey, Sam, like kind of in secret, he said, hey, I can get a note out of this prison for you. So of course I light up, I'm like, what, like really? And he says, tomorrow, it's Saturday, and that's the day that visitors come to this prison. I have a friend coming, and I'm going to switch out my laundry with him. He's going to bring me clean clothes, I'm going to give him my dirty clothes, and this is how I do my laundry. And I will put your note in my laundry. And so this was great, but what happened was when he came to me with this offer, because of the schedule of the prison, I had like 30 seconds to write this note before I was being moved back to my cell or whatever it was. And this was so frustrating because you just sit around all day with nothing happening at all, and then all of a sudden there's something of substance and you've only got 30 seconds to do it. It was so frustrating. So I quickly scribbled this, and it was actually Irfan who suggested that I write a clue. I gave the note back to him, and he said, put a clue on there so it gets there. And so I quickly wrote the Missouri Athletic Club, came up with it in 5 seconds, and then I gave him the note, and I had put my father's phone number on it, and it turned out, and I didn't know about this until after I was released weeks later, that note actually made it to my father.
Yeah, that's a good explanation. But there was also a phone call from a number in Florida of some
That was the
guy.
note.
That was the note?
Yeah.
Okay. And that was somebody claiming to have information on Sam, and we said, this is a scam. These people want money. And, but very interesting. Any other questions? Lourdes?
Praise be Jesus Christ.
Amen.
Thank you.
Thank you for, it's so inspiring. I can't help but think of these other young American journalists. You mentioned ISIS, and he was beheaded by ISIS. And right now his name is escaping me, but I'm sure that you know what I'm talking about.
Your
His family is captive.
yeah, probably.
She's talking about Austin Tice.
No, she's talking about James Foley. James Foley.
Oh,
Yeah. So, and I've actually become close with the family. I know Diane, his mother, very well.
Can you explain a little bit Syria, ISIS, that whole thing? Like they threaten you with ISIS or something. How exactly is that? Can you shed a little light?
Sure. So one of the big differences between myself and Jim Foley was we were there at different times. So he was there in 2012, was captured and held for 2 years, and then beheaded in August of 2014. And this was really when the Civil War was really picking up and really beginning to pick up steam. I was there in 2019. Things were kind of dying down a little bit, different situation. And also ISIS had kind of been, kind of moved out of Syria a little bit. So, different situations. When, during my interrogation, the interrogator threatened to hand me over, looking back on that now, I don't think that was realistic. I don't think that they were actually going to do that. I think they were just pushing my buttons to see how I would react to different things. Yeah.
Felipe. Michelle, can you?
Yeah.
Vicariously.
Thank you. Hang on, sorry. I only heard part of that.
Yeah. What did
Loss
we,
of-
the
Say loss of weight or loss of faith? There.
what is it? He did lose a lot of weight. You did lose a lot of weight. Not sure. Looking back, I'm not always sure that I, handled it in the best way. But I think that one of the things that really comes to mind when I hear that question is that, I grew up Catholic, and am grateful to say that I feel, strong in my faith. And when I got into that situation, as I mentioned, I realized that everything had been taken from me, but no matter what, that could not be stripped. I knew that was absolute. But what I realized was that the reason that it was there for me, or one of the big reasons, was because it was something that I had worked on my whole life and practiced and developed it and built it. And I don't think that we can just expect that to magically be there for us when we need it if we're not always taking the time to work on it and develop it every day. And so I think that really what I remember was thinking, this is one of the reasons why I've worked on this my whole life, so it's here, when you need it and you have that rock. We're just going to take one more question.
I learned a couple words. Right, I know very little. Okay. Wanta kifa. Yeah.
But we got transferred to Damascus. It's just amazing to me because you don't know how to trust people nowadays. Categorize countries and people from certain locations. So it's amazing that you're able to establish a relationship with these prisoners.
Yeah, very different. These men were truly some of the most remarkable people I've ever met. And I've been fortunate to meet people in lots of different places. I realized and learned pretty quickly that virtually none of them were true criminals, but instead just victims of a corrupt regime's criminal justice system. I remember asking, actually Irfan, the same guy who smuggled out the letter, this was a couple weeks in, I said, so everybody here is so nice to me. You know, I wasn't sure what to expect in a place like this. And he said, Sam, in Syria, all the good people are here in prison because all the bad people are outside putting us in here. I have a quick story about these glasses real quick.
Okay.
It's real quick. When I got to Adra, one of the issues I brought like all kinds of problems. I had all kinds of issues, but one of the things that had happened was I wear contacts, and when I was in solitary confinement, my contacts had expired, and like my eyes were all, and I couldn't really see. That didn't matter when I was just looking at four walls all day, but when I got to Adra and I was going to court and I was talking to people, I was getting kind of frustrated not being able to see anything far away. And so I asked a couple of the other prisoners, I said, hey, is there a way, like maybe, I don't know, like maybe I could get some glasses or something, like I can't see. And so I found out that there was a guy at this prison who was sort of like a quote unquote eye doctor. And so a couple of them helped me put in this request to go see this doctor. So I waited, and a week later I went into this little room, and he had this like piece of optometry equipment from like the Stone Age. And I told him, I said, listen, my eyes are fine, like there's no problem. I just was wondering maybe I could get some glasses. So we did a couple like tests with this like rickety machine, and then he handed me a receipt, and he said, Sam, after you just pay for the glasses, then I'll order them and you can have them. So this was a little bit, this was put me in kind of a tough spot because I didn't have anything with me, like, let alone any money, right? So I was taken back to the cell, and I told a couple of the other prisoners, like, yeah, the appointment was fine, but I'm not going to be getting glasses. The next morning, the three of them came to me and they said, Sam, we talked to the doctor and we paid for your glasses. You'll have them in a couple days. And so a couple days later, they showed up, and being able to see again was like one of the brightest moments of my entire captivity. And today I still have those glasses. They're right here. And also is my unpaid receipt.
Powerful. Well, I want to thank you, Sam Goodwin, for coming out and being here with us and sharing your story. I know a lot of the parishioners have wanted to meet you, and you're coming to say thank you, but they want to also say you were part of our lives during this captivity and how much we prayed for you, and we were there every step of the way. And I thank this beautiful community for that care and concern. Something that you said to me when we were in Cuba, he said, one of the most fascinating things is that people are people everywhere. And that's the humanity, and that we all belong to one family. And you really only come to understand this when you're in a situation like this, or when you're traveling abroad and when you meet different cultures. And really, when you're meeting people and people are generous and hospitable. And so that's a beautiful lesson. And thank you for being here and for sharing your heart and really conveying to us how much the Lord means to you and how much your faith means to us. And I think it's a lesson for all of us that we don't know when that moment comes, or God forbid, we have to cross that edge where we need the Lord in our life. And have we done the homework, like you said? Have we done our prayers, our devotionals? Do we have that relationship with Christ where we know him? He's our friend. He's my confidant. I can rely on him. Or is it just some complete stranger that now I need you? Well, where have you been all your life? And so, very powerful. We're glad you're home, and come back and visit us anytime.
It's my pleasure. Truly, I can't say thank you enough. I don't know that I would be here without all of the prayers from the people in this church right now. So thank you so much. I'm forever indebted. And I look forward to coming back lots of times, hopefully.
So thank you. Good night.
Yeah.